This is a super exciting topic. I understand you heard from Tammy this morning, who is my colleague at OSOI. She does all spine. We are an orthopedic group that does pretty much everything. And they started a bone health clinic about 3 years ago just to diagnose, treat, and manage bone, and osteoporosis specifically. It's odd, as some people originally think it's odd when you think of osteoporosis being treated in an orthopedic setting. However, bone is the surgeon's wood. Like a carpenter needs really good wood to be able to put hardware in and build a house. An orthopedic surgeon needs really, really good bone to put all that fancy hardware in, the knees, the hips, the spinal hardware. If there's not good bone, their outcomes are not quite as good. Or if they get into surgery and find really bad bone, it makes for a very unhappy orthopedic surgeon. And we like our surgeons to be happy, so we try real hard for that not to happen. So osteoporosis historically has kind of been in the Bermuda Triangle of medicine, where nobody really kind of owned the problem. It was treated a little bit in primary care when we had time, and I did primary care for 11 years, so it was when I had time. Nobody complains about it. So in primary care, very often we're treating things people complain about, or things we see in the office, their blood pressure, their temperature, things like that. Endocrinologists, rheumatology have dabbled in osteoporosis over the years. Occasionally you'll find one that really likes bone, and so they'll treat a lot of it. But primarily, bone has been centered in orthopedics. Only orthopedic surgeons don't treat chronic disease, and osteoporosis is a chronic disease. And when I got to orthopedics and I said, you're telling me that you guys, I'm over here in primary care and treating 15 things in 15 minutes, and you guys are looking at a broken bone, you can't treat osteoporosis as well, you need a separate clinic for that? Yes, they do, because they don't treat chronic disease. They don't know how to manage it, they don't know how to treat it, and they don't want to treat it over the span of a lifetime. So it's a completely different animal from an orthopedic group setting, but it's also a very important thing for them. I mentioned earlier, let's see if I can make this go. Nope. Can I make it advance? The arrows?
Should.
Turn it on. Yes. Boom. That's the on-off button. Okay. My disclosures, I do speak for both Eli Lilly and Radius Health, primarily on a little bit on bone medications, but primarily both of them have bone health clinic or FLS non-branded programs that they do across the country in orthopedic groups, teaching orthopedic surgeons how to have bone health clinics and how to treat bone. As Dr. McMahon said, I graduated in 2004. I was in a traditional private practice from 2004 to 2014 and have been in bone health clinic ever since. So real quick, I know you guys already have seen this. You've already done bone biology, but it's really hard to understand how we lose bone if we don't know how we make it. And so really quick, that cycle of osteoblasts, then the osteoclasts come in, they kind of remove that older and fatigued bone, and those osteoclasts will differentiate. They go through a reversal process that we don't really understand very well, actually, that reversal process. And then they turn into osteoblasts, which eventually we end up with a neutral bone balance there at the top. So that whole process, which in the picture, I don't really have a picture of an osteocyte. Osteocytes are terminally differentiated osteoblasts. So when we're making new bone and we have new healthy bone, we're also making new cells that live in bone. Osteocytes live in bone, they're the longest living cell in bone, and those are the communicators. They communicate to the osteoclasts when we have damaged and fatigued bone. So this whole bone thing is a process, it's a cycle, and at some point in the process it gets dysregulated. So we don't build as much or make as much bone as we are taking up. That's what happens in osteoporosis. Bone, this whole cycle, when we do this one time, it's called a bone remodeling unit, and we have that in both cancellous and in cortical bone. At any given time, your skeleton has about 1 million bone remodeling units working at any given time, and the adult skeleton should regenerate itself about every 10 years, which is pretty cool. Osteoporosis itself, a skeletal disorder characterized by compromised bone strength. I didn't say density, I said bone strength. So you can have a lot of bone, but your bone quality sucks, and so therefore you still have osteoporosis. I didn't say it's bone density, I said it was bone strength, and that's really important. Bone strength is the issue, not just the density of bone. Osteoporosis is the most common kind of bone disease. It's a metabolic bone disease. We're going to talk about a few other metabolic bone diseases as well. Symptoms of osteoporosis, there are none. which is why we don't treat it in primary care very well. Nobody comes into the doctor and says, oh man, I think I'm losing some bone, so we need to do that before I break my hip, because that would be super helpful. But they don't, so we have to screen for it, or we have to recognize it when we have the smaller fractures or little warning signs. But there are very few symptoms. There is some evidence to suggest that people who have really bad bone, I mean really thin bone, that their bone actually does ache a little bit, but it's not well understood, and we're not quite ready to say that yes, you can feel osteoporosis, but there is some evidence of that. Risk factors, look at that long list. There are a ton of risk factors for bone loss. This is a huge, huge and growing population because there are so many risk factors. The biggest one being menopause in women and low testosterone in men. And we have a giant population of young men with low T who now have osteoporotic bone. I can't tell you how many texts and emails I get from the surgical suite from a surgeon who's putting in a hip implant in a 45-year-old guy, 50-year-old guy, and their bone is so terrible that they put the implant in and then have to brace it and not let them weight bear on it because the bone was so bad because their testosterone was so low, only it was undiagnosed, and their bone has become terrible because those bone remodeling units require some hormone to work. And so that process again got dysregulated and they were not regenerating bone. And so low T is a big one. And then disuse, being confined to a bed, a wheelchair, or other inactive lifestyles. So being confined to a wheelchair, think about your younger population of CP kids or children or young adults who maybe have been in a wheelchair a long period of their life. They are at risk for osteoporosis. So we need to remember that when we see anybody in a wheelchair, that even though they might not be the classic 50-year-old Caucasian petite female, they're at risk for osteoporosis. I had a patient last week who is a 30-year-old female, very high-functioning CP, but in a wheelchair for the bulk of her life, just ran her wheelchair into a wall kind of by accident, just took a corner a little bit sharp, or wide actually, this case may be, and her leg, her thigh hit the wall and broke her femur. That shouldn't happen. So she had terrible osteoporosis. Vitamin D deficiency, huge problem. A low calcium diet is not a huge problem actually in the Midwest and in the United States. We tend to eat and drink a lot of calcium. GI surgeries, growing population here, your gastric banding patients, bypass, the sleeve, the band. Anytime we mess with the GI tract, we do take out a chunk of the colon, we are messing with your ability to absorb nutrients, which then messes with your ability to absorb bone. Additionally, gastric patients also have a huge issue with vitamin D deficiency before surgery. So this is a population that already now has two risk factors. History of hyperparathyroidism. So they are pulling bone until they're treated. They are pulling bone, causing them to have a secondary osteoporosis. The hypogonadism in men. Other endocrine disorders, if you have just hyperthyroidism, will cause it. There's other endocrine diseases as well. Chronic rheumatoid arthritis, any truly of the rheumatologic diseases, partly it's the disease course and partly it's the medications that we use on those patients. Anybody who's taken an oral steroid or a seizure medicine, particularly the older ones, Depakote, Dilantin, Keppra, those ones, really interfere with bone and will cause a secondary osteoporosis. Family history of osteoporosis is a big one. Genetics is a huge factor. We didn't check, and we weren't very good at checking a generation ago. And so they may, instead of asking if your mom or dad has a history of osteoporosis, you ask them, have they ever broken their hip? Did they ever have a compression fracture of the spine? Did they ever break anything? Did they ever fall from standing height and have a fracture? If they did, that's a huge red flag. Or were they stooped like this? Maybe they didn't have x-rays of their spine, but they're walking with a major kyphosis. That also is indication of osteoporosis. Of course, smoking and excessive alcohol consumption, we pretty much know those. And anybody who's been treated for breast cancer or prostate cancer. Primarily in men with prostate cancer, it is the hormones that they use, the hormone suppressants, the Lupron, by a trade name, that suppresses testosterone. Sometimes we will use Lupron in younger men with prostate cancer for quite a long period of time to make them not need surgery, at least for a while, or use it after surgery if needed. The downside with that is we're suppressing their testosterone to such low levels that again, we're back to that low T. And I have quite a few patients that are in that category as well. And then the breast cancer patients, it's both the chemotherapy as well as the tamoxifen or those estrogen suppressing agents after surgery. Tamoxifen has typically been used for about 5 years for a lot of breast cancer patients. However, recently, they've talked about using it longer, using it for 10 years. And the primary reason that that has not been a recommendation for everybody is because of bone, because it's so bad for bone. Why we treat osteoporosis, so if you can't see it and you can't feel it, why do we treat it? And I usually tell patients it's probably not going to kill you, which is actually not true. It's one of the leading causes of mortality. But the mortality from an osteoporosis patient, by the time you get to be about 55 or 60, most of these patients, even 70, they'll look at you and go, something's got to kill me. They're tired of taking pills. They don't want to be treated. The problem with osteoporosis is it doesn't kill you right away. You're not going to have a heart attack and die right there with it. You're going to have a long period of morbidity where you are in a nursing home. You're at Aunt Susie's house and they're caring for you. You can't drive. You can't walk yourself to the bathroom. You can't put weight on your leg. You have a huge period of disability. And that's the biggest problem with osteoporosis, is it doesn't kill you right away. It's the #1 cause of nursing home admission in the United States, osteoporotic fracture is. It's very disabling. That's the biggest issue with it. It's also very expensive. We don't regain a lot of function back sometimes from these fractures, so patients require a lot of care afterwards, which is very expensive. The death rate is very, very high. It's actually greater than the rates for breast, ovarian, and cervical cancer combined in women. So death rate is pretty high, but the period of morbidity is actually a bigger issue. Fracture is a sentinel event. So when you have a patient that has it over the 50 that has a fracture, a fragility fracture. A fragility fracture is a fall from standing height that results in a fracture. It doesn't matter what you landed on. It could be the carpet, it could be the dog, it could be the tile, it could be grass, it's sand. I had somebody land in sand and break their humerus. Those are fragility fractures. Those fragility fractures in adults are sentinel events, meaning it's a precursor to something and it's a red flag. Those fractures that one fracture makes you twice as likely to fracture again. And then after the next fracture, twice as likely again. And the statistics just keep on climbing until you're the lady I saw last week with 13 fractures in 10 years. And we see that all the time in orthopedics. And that's why my surgical group said, oh my gosh, we need a bone health program. It's killing us. We see grandma with a fracture over here, a forearm fracture, and within 2 years, she's back with a hip fracture. Yes, it's because the forearm fracture makes you 5 times more likely to break your hip in the next 5 to 7 years. And ethically, orthopedic surgeons feel a responsibility to do something about that. So fracture begets fracture is what we say. Who do we test? So if nobody fractures, how do we know who to test? We should be screening people who are estrogen deficient women. So is that always a postmenopausal female? Are they always 55 and above? No. You might have a 30-year-old who had a hysterectomy with an oophorectomy and no hormone replacement therapy because they can't for some other contraindicated reason. And so that patient is now an estrogen deficient woman. She should be screened within the next couple of years for bone and continue to be screened. Men with risk factors. So that first statement there, men over 70, that's an easy black and white thing. Men over 70 should be screened. But men with risk factors, remember that long risk factor list that we looked at? They can be screened earlier if they have a risk factor, they have low T, if they have some reason, if they have a really strong genetic history of early fracture, they should be screened earlier. Sometimes we look at patients for medication monitoring. Maybe they're on seizure medication, maybe they're on prednisone therapy. We need to make sure they're on some type of high-risk medication. And then just men and women over 50 that had a history of fracture. We don't know why they broke necessarily. Maybe we can't for sure say that it's a fragility fracture, but we know that they broke and they're over the age of 50. They absolutely need to be screened. And that's actually in Medicare for Medicare, for HEDIS, for PQRS, and for all these Medicare measures that we talk about now. It is a measure. And so anybody over 50 with a fracture, in our computer system, it's an automatic pop-up, and it says, in big giant letters, screen for osteoporosis. It wasn't something that we added to our computer system, our EHR. It was preloaded because it is a Medicare measure. That's how important osteoporosis has become to Medicare, because it's the ninth most expensive disease that they treat. They don't want anybody to keep breaking because it's very expensive for them to treat these fractures. So we diagnose osteoporosis by definition by having a certain fragility fracture. There are 3 fragility fractures specifically that diagnose osteoporosis. a fall from standing height that breaks your hip, your forearm, or you have a compression fracture of your spine, either from a fall or from lifting, coughing, laughing, sneezing, any of those things. That is a diagnostic of osteoporosis without any other test. You don't need advanced imaging to diagnose. Now you can move on and also get bone densitometry, but you don't have to. Bone densitometry is what we use to diagnose DEXA. You'll see images of it later. It looks like an x-ray, but it's not. It is actually a system that uses very low levels of radiation to detect how thick that bone actually is, how much bone is in your bone, is what I tell patients. It's currently the best way. It won't always be the best way. It's not the greatest test in the world, but it's all we have. There's a lot of new up and coming ways to check bone density that will use things similar to DEXA, but that'll change over the next 10 years. But right now, that is the standard of care testing. Surgeons can also diagnose osteoporosis. When my surgeons have cut off the femur and they're getting ready to put an implant in, they look down the shaft of that femur. And if they don't see any bone, hello, osteoporosis. That's the best test in the world. And I always tell them they got to cheat. They got to look at the bone. That's the best test in the world. So they can diagnose it as well. If they document it, we're good. That's a diagnostic of osteoporosis. They can also do a bone biopsy. Spine surgeons don't always have the ability, they're not opening up those vertebral bodies, so we don't always see what's inside. But they can do bone biopsies, and they can tell me what's inside as well. So that's another way to diagnose. Bone density itself, a little bit more about it. It's very non-invasive. You're going to see a picture of it here in a minute. It distinguishes your bone from soft tissue and from muscle. So it's technically the standard of care for diagnosing osteoporosis, but we also use it. You'll see at the end there, it says DEXA machines are used for total body composition. That is probably the fastest growing use of this machine. It will measure lean mass, fat mass, organ mass, so that it separates all those tissue types. So the best way to get somebody's total body fat is actually from a DEXA machine. It's the gold standard for fat measurement as well. So colleges use these. OU just bought a big, beautiful new machine that one of our docs reads all of their DEXAs, and they use it for fat mass and lean mass for their athletes. We use it some for body composition in young athletes, young people who are injured and they need to go back to their sport, but we're not quite sure if they've rehabbed completely all the way. We will look at their lean muscle mass. Maybe they blew at their ACL. So we'll look at their lean muscle mass on the right lower extremity compared to the left lower extremity. And if they're 2 pounds or more off muscle mass, or they have less muscle mass on the injured side, then they're not ready to go back to play yet. We need to do some more rehab. The risk for injury is very, very high. So there's a lot of other reasons we use these machines. Pediatrics uses them for growth and development sometimes. There's such a very small amount of radiation. We worry about radiation exposure these days a lot. And this is a very, very low radiation exposure test. And so pediatricians will sometimes use this for growth and development surveys. The machine looks like that. That is a pretty standard looking DEXA machine. Literally the patient lays on that table with their head on the pillow. What you see on the end, that triangle thing, is that positioner. It takes about literally 5 minutes to scan 4 different sites. So it's very, very quick and easy. It's not invasive, it doesn't hurt. They do need to be able to lie flat, which sometimes can be an issue. We can do forearm studies where they sit next to the machine, so if they can't lay down, we still have an option. But this, it's very easy. It's an easy test. We already kind of talked about who should be tested. This is the United States Preventative Service Task Force recommendation. And so for testing purposes on your big test, these are the numbers that you want to memorize for that test, because that is who, on those tests, they will refer back to that recommendation. DEXA report. So when you order a DEXA scan on your patient and you get it back, what should it tell you? These are all the things that should be on a DEXA test report. Mostly bone densitometry numbers, their correlating T and Z scores, which we'll look at, the quality of the study, and when this next study should be ordered. There's a lot of pitfalls to it, and we're going to talk about those in a minute. The DEXA test itself, the biggest thing you're looking for most patients is a T-score. T is in Tom. The T-score tells me where that patient is compared to normal. I don't want to test a 75-year-old compared to her other 75-year-old friends, because they're probably very, very likely to all have a considerable amount of bone loss. I want to test her compared to normal so that I know how much bone she's potentially lost. And historically, we have always used that term, lost. But when I tested a patient for the first time at 75 years old, and she's never had a bone density test before, which is pretty frequent, and her scores come back at a minus 2.5, which is osteoporosis. And I have to look at her and say, okay, you've lost this much bone, but has she really lost it, or did she never have it? I don't know. I would never checked. I tested a lot of 50-year-olds that have osteoporosis. Had I not checked them until 75, I would have told them that they lost that bone in the last 20 years, or maybe they haven't had it for 20 years. So we use that term, lost, a lot, but it's not really the correct term. If we started screening appropriately and early enough, most of these patients, we'd have a better idea if that bone was actually lost. And sometimes patients have old DEXAs, and we can pull them and we can go back and kind of look over time to see, yes, did we lose this bone? Did we really never have it? Some of us don't build very much bone. We assume everybody gets to normal, but that may not always be true. So what we're learning, we've learned a lot about bone and bone loss over the last 10 to 15 years, and everything we've learned is completely different than what we thought we knew 20 years ago. So that term lost, and I'll probably say it again down the road and later in the lecture, we may not have lost it. It may just never have been there, so kind of keep that in mind. On that, the test will give you a T-score, and that T-score is on that bell curve. 0 is normal, -1 is where we start osteopenia, which means a little bit of bone loss, and -2.5 is the start of osteoporosis. In osteopenia, it's a pretty wide zone, -1 to -2.5. That's a pretty wide area. And in that zone, we talk about having mild osteopenia, moderate osteopenia, and we look at what we do in that area depends on the patient. We don't always treat those patients, but we can, and we'll talk about that later. After -2.5 and into osteoporosis, we almost always treat those patients, or we do something in there. Once you get to -2.5, we don't really care how much further you get, because once you're bad, you're bad. And so we don't say you have mild osteoporosis, moderate osteoporosis, or severe osteoporosis, because once your risk for fracture goes up, which it does significantly after -2.5, fracture is fracture. We don't have a mild fracture and a severe fracture. Really, broken is broken. So we don't have levels of osteoporosis. Anything above -1 is considered normal. And we do have patients. I had an 85-year-old this morning that had a bone density better than mine. She was a 1.5. So it puts her on the other side of the scale. Genetically, she has great bone. Maybe she's done things in her life that help build bone. I have no idea, but regardless, she's going to do great with her hip replacement surgery in a couple weeks. So she has great bone to be able to go into surgery with. And that's what we're looking for. So age is not always a factor either. The Z-scores that you will also see on the test are uncommonly used, but these are your pediatric patients. These are patients under the age of 50, maybe they're premenopausal women, they still have a menstrual cycle, they're young men. This is comparing you to, bless you, to a normal. So last week, the young dancer that I saw who has osteogenesis imperfecta, she has been screened with a DEXA scan since pretty much she could walk, age 1 or 2. She's had multiple fractures over her life, as they do, and what we look at with treatment for them is their Z-score. If we can keep their Z-score in normal range, we feel like we're doing pretty well with them. And so we screened her with a Z-score measurement, and with the Z-score, it's the same bell curve, but we just want to be better than -2 for them. It's the same idea, it's just comparing you to an age-matched, gender-matched, ethnicity-matched group. So you're matching along everything that we can. We're trying to control all the variables, and we're matching everything. When you're young, that's what we want to do. I don't want to compare you to a norm. I want to compare you to people your own age. When you get a DEXA report back, always get the pictures that go with it. I promise there's always pictures available, regardless of if they say, oh, our machine doesn't print pictures. Yes, it does. They all do. There's no software that exists for any DEXA machine, and there's not that many, and I know all of them, that doesn't print pictures. Always ask for pictures, because sometimes whoever read the bone density machine test, or whoever did it or performed it, didn't do it right. And it happens all the time. And if you get back a score that looks funny or out of range for what you expected, then ask for the pictures, because 9 times out of 10, it's not correct. So this is a spine and a femur bone density test. And on the spine, you can see we do lumbar levels L1 through L4. And what you'll see on scans that are not done correctly is they will have included T12, which has a rib attached to it, or T11 even. Sometimes you look at these back and see 4 ribs, and you think, well, that's not the lumbar spine, unless this person has weird anatomy. So always look at the anatomical picture first, identify your own markers first, don't use theirs, identify your own markers, and then make sure you agree with what they've labeled those areas, okay? Same thing on the femur. Make that rectangular box, the tall rectangular box should be over the femur neck. There's a smaller box, a square within, that should be placed within the femur neck, partly inside that rectangle. That's Ward's area. It's one of the weakest areas in the femur. And then you should have your triangles, which should include the trochanter areas. So I have seen reports where the femur come back where the femur neck rectangle wasn't even on bone. It was off into just the black neutral zone area, and the patient had reported a score of an osteoporotic score. Well, yes, if you're measuring soft tissue and the machine thinks it's bone, we have a problem. And I had to ask for pictures in order to get it. So always ask for pictures and just glance at the areas and make sure it looks even remotely correct. The scores look like the picture here on your right, where you get femur neck scores, you get upper neck scores, you get scores throughout Ward's area, the trochanter, the shaft, and the neck, and the total femur. So what we're looking at here is the left femur, and you should get scores for left femur and right femur and the spine every time. If they cannot do one of those areas, then you should also get a distal 1/3 radius or a forearm scan as well. So what you're looking at here, this is a lot of scores. You don't always get this kind of detailed report back. We do, because we do a lot of orthopedic work on the hip, so we want to know every little area. I'm going to put a screw in there, I want to know where it's going and if it's going to stay. So we look at a lot of areas. More commonly, you'll just get a femur neck score and a total femur score. And that's enough to diagnose osteoporosis, so that's perfect. And this patient has osteoporosis because their femur neck score is minus 2.7. Even though their total femur score is minus 1.7, because any score reaches minus 2.5 or below, that is a diagnostic of osteoporosis. So if you have a spine score, L1 through 4, that is minus 1.2. And a femur neck score, that's minus 2.7. And a total femur score, that's minus 2, that patient has osteoporosis because they have one score in those areas that is beyond the minus 2.5. So we take the worst score in one of at least 3 areas, if we can get 3 areas, to diagnose osteoporosis. There's the forearm score. We only do the forearm if we cannot get one of those other areas, or we suspect that down the road we won't be able to scan one of those areas. In orthopedics, I always scan the forearm, but that's not true in general practice. But given that I work with guys who like to put a lot of hardware in, I generally will lose the spine or those femurs eventually. I can't scan a total hip implant, or I can, but I can't diagnose osteoporosis from it. The spine, when we put hardware in, when Tammy goes in and puts hardware in everybody, I can't scan the lumbar spine anymore. FRAX is also a diagnostic tool. FRAX is a risk assessment. So the osteoporosis gurus in the world decided that DEXA was not infallible, that there were some people that did not have osteoporotic DEXAs, but they should probably be treated because they were really high risk for fracture. So they made this FRAX tool. The FRAX tool estimates a patient's 10-year fracture risk at both the hip and overall. And so we put risk factors into a FRAX tool. So it looks like this, and the computer does it. Now, when you get a FRAX score back on a bone density report, you are trusting that the tech, whoever entered the information into this program, did it correctly. Does she know what a fragility fracture is? Does she know what, did she ask about alcohol? Did she ask about family history? Did she ask specifically about hip fracture, or did she just say your parents have osteoporosis? Does she know what a glucocorticoid is? You know, did she ask about that? You're trusting the tech. So if you suspect that the FRAX is actually higher than what it should be, given the DEXA scan that you got back and the FRAX score that you got back, you can recalculate the FRAX score. There's a million apps for it. You can go online and recalculate it and do it yourself. It does include these hip scores from the DEXA scan. So you can only do a FRAX on patients who were able to have a femur DEXA score run. It doesn't have to be both femurs, it has to be at least one femur. You cannot run a FRAX from data from the spine or from forearm. So you will not get a FRAX if they couldn't have a hip done. That could be because they broke their hip, maybe they have hardware in there, or maybe they have a total hip replacement. A FRAX report looks a little bit like this. Major overall risk of osteoporotic fracture, and this patient is 14.7. We want that to be less than 20%. Anything above 20%, we want to start to say, well, maybe we should treat this patient. They're osteopenic, but their overall fracture risk is high. The other thing I didn't say, and I think it was on a previous slide, we don't run a FRAX score on osteoporotic patients. They're already bad. They don't need a FRAX score. Their risk of fracture is high just by the nature of their osteoporotic. So we don't need to run a FRAX score on them. We run a FRAX score on osteopenic patients, people who are in that kind of gray zone. That's who we need a little more information, and we may need to treat. The hip fracture risk for this patient is 2.1% over 10 years. Anything over 3% should make you consider treatment. These are all clinical decisions. It doesn't mean we have to treat, but it means we should think about it. And you can see underneath here, or underneath the population-based, number one, looking at the population, this was a Caucasian patient, but FRAX changes with ethnicity. It also changes with region of the world. So if you're in France, you get a different FRAX calculator than in the United States or in Poland. Everybody has different FRAX calculators based on their population. You can also see the risk factors that were entered. So if you believe them to be wrong, they should be listed right there. They should tell you what risk factors that they used, so you know if it was done correctly. So how do we diagnose osteoporosis? We can do it by bone density alone. By a T-score of minus 2.5 or less, that is diagnostic of osteoporosis. The quality of the bone. Do they have a history of fracture? Have they fallen and done anything? Have they had surgery? You have an orthopedic surgeon's report that you can pull, and orthopedic surgeons talk about bone on their reports all the time. They are not always great about calling it osteoporosis. When I first started, my orthopedic surgeons wanted to call everything osteopenia. They would text me and say, oh, you gotta go fix this bone, it's terrible. They have terrible osteoporosis, and I would go read their note, and it would say a patient had osteopenia. And you can't do that to me. I need this for insurance purposes to get medicine approved. And they'd say, oh, it's the same thing. Oh, it's not. It is a totally different thing. But they were trained in a way that radiologically, they read things as osteopenia. And so sometimes they will call it osteopenia even when it's osteoporosis. They will also use terms like marshmallow bone and butter bone, which is very descriptive. The density and quality together equal bone strength, which is ultimately what we care about. So now we have a diagnosis of osteoporosis, but we kind of want to make sure we don't have another metabolic bone disease going on. So let's rule out the other things that could be happening. Hyperparathyroidism is, if you are treating osteoporosis, something that you will come across quite a bit, as much as anybody can. It's a relatively rare problem, but fracture and osteoporosis are pretty much the hallmark symptoms that people actually pay attention to. And specifically on DEXA scan, if I have a patient who has a normal, relatively normal, femur scores and spine scores, but their forearm score is terribly osteoporotic, that screams hyperparathyroidism. And that should be the first thing on your brain. Sometimes it's not, but that generally when you have a hyperparathyroid patient, the forearm score is the worst score. On patients who have a postmenopausal osteoporosis, very commonly the forearm is actually the best score. It takes the longest to lose that bone. So we want to rule out on every osteoporotic patient that is questionably going to receive treatment. We want to make sure they don't have hyperparathyroidism. So we will run an intact PTH, which has probably never been run in their life. It's not something we typically do. And of course a calcium score. Sometimes that intact PTH can be elevated because of a whole other reason. So if their intact PTH comes back and it's 110 or 200, it's not super high, but their calcium is normal. For hyperparathyroidism, we generally need, for primary hyperparathyroidism, we need both the PTH and that calcium score to be elevated. in a secondary hyperparathyroidism, which will still cause bone loss, we will have just an elevated BTH, but a normal calcium. So that requires further investigation. Osteomalacia is also another metabolic bone disease, primarily from vitamin D issues. You can run an alkaline phosphatase as well as a vitamin D. Paget's disease causes you to make more bone. So people sometimes are surprised when we talk about this in an osteoporosis lecture, but Paget's disease and that extra bone that it makes, actually they fracture a ton because the bone is crappy bone. It doesn't hold hardware well, it breaks, it's not good bone. And then renal osteodystrophy. So we have a huge population of chronic kidney disease. And chronic kidney disease is getting worse and more common and all kinds of things that we have a ton of huge need for nephrology because we have a huge population of this borderline to severe renal osteodystrophy from chronic kidney disease. These patients have adynamic bone. So it's not that they have osteoporosis, but it's not from just a postmenopausal or hypogonadic state, it's from their kidney disease. And kidney disease patients usually will have adynamic bone, meaning not only is it being blocked or it's dysregulated, it's not doing anything. And so we have to be careful in using medicines in these patients because we don't want to give them a medicine to further suppress something that's not working. So with those patients, we're not fixing the renal osteodystrophy, we're not fixing the renal problems, but we have to be aware of how we got to this point with the bone because we got to choose medicines wisely. Another way to diagnose is our bone turnover markers. And this is a relatively new thing. They've been used in research for a really long time, but they are used somewhat in practice now. The markers of resorption, there are on the left, or on the left. The more common one in that group that you'll hear about is CTX, the middle one. CTX is a relatively common marker of resorption. So if you had somebody who for some reason you thought was resorbing bone, their DEXA was terrible, and you could figure out any reason, zero reason for it, you could run a marker of resorption, see if they were just for some reason absorbing bone beyond what is considered normal. Markers of formation are the more common one there is the third one, which we abbreviate P1NP. And that one we will use sometimes when bone density studies are too good. I did run P1NP probably 3 or 4 weeks ago. I had an 80-year-old guy getting ready to have a hip replacement whose bone density scores were 5 and 6, way off the chart, normal. And so we did some bone marker studies on him just to make sure we didn't have a different type of metabolic bone disease going on. Who do we treat? So now that we're in treatment, we've diagnosed him, we know we have osteoporosis, who do we want to treat? For sure, we want to consider treatment in anybody who is osteoporotic. We also want to consider treatment with anybody who is osteopenic but has a high FRAX score or a high fracture risk. But you also have to use your clinical judgment. If you think somebody needs treatment because they're a high fall risk or they have a history of fracture or for some other reason, then, or maybe their hardware is falling out or there's some other reason, use your clinical judgment. There's a lot of gray area in this disease state for who needs treatment and who doesn't. Treatment, we start with vitamins, we start with lifestyle, and then we move into medications. Vitamin D, I talk about first for vitamins. Everybody thinks I want to talk about calcium first. And calcium is what we told your grandmothers and your great-grandmothers, and maybe your mothers, but you guys are really young, so probably not. To take a whole bunch of calcium and it was going to fix their bone. We told them that for 25 years. And so we had this huge group of patients that took a ton of calcium and broke their hips at greater rates than any other generation because we were just flat wrong. The original recommendations were based off of conventional wisdom. Bones are made of minerals, we should just apply a whole bunch more mineral, and we should give them calcium and magnesium and zinc, and that will fix their bone. But it didn't work. And so the studies that we designed, of course, to prove ourselves correct, didn't work. And so we went back to the drawing board, and what they discovered is vitamin D. And so about 10 years ago, vitamin D started to be talked about, and now it's pretty much the trendiest thing ever. Vitamin D is kind of that pin in the bone world. If you take that pin out, nothing else works, which is why we have this osteomalacia history. Osteomalacia is an inability to absorb and metabolize vitamin D. Vitamin D is really, 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 really important for bone. We have patients that have hardware failure simply because their vitamin D is low. Their bone becomes very, very soft. That's where the butter bone and the marshmallow bone comes from. That's not always osteoporosis. Sometimes the surgeons will send me a message and say, oh, their bone was awful, it was like butter. Well, was it like butter but there was a lot of it, or was it like butter and there wasn't any of it? Because that is a huge difference. You can have a lot of bone, but it's really bad quality bone. And that oftentimes is simply from vitamin D deficiency. When your vitamin D is really low, it drives up the body's desire to make better quality bone. It just can't. But because it's trying to make better quality bone, it drives up your PTH. So sometimes that PTH with a normal calcium is because the patients have a really low vitamin D. And the body's trying to have really good quality bone. It's trying to go to that bone and make new bone and repair bone and drive that process, but it's not working. And so instead of, what the body does is keep kicking out PTH and keep kicking out PTH. So we end up with a secondary hyperparathyroidism because the vitamin D was so low and consistently low for a long time. This is the sun vitamin. And so why are we all low? Why is this such a big issue all of a sudden? Well, we tint your car windows, we tint your office windows. You don't have windows in here. And we tell you to stay out of the sun. My generation, we put oil on and baked outside and bleached our hair, and we stayed outside until we got blisters because we wanted to be tan. You guys know it's cool to be not tan and to be very, very pale. And so the problem with that is the dermatologists are very happy, but the orthopedic surgeons are unhappy because you can't keep everybody happy. So what's happened is we've blocked D from everybody's life, sunblock, lotions and soap. Did you know every makeup in the United States has an SPF of at least 10, and an SPF of 8 blocks 90% of your D absorption. And we did that trying to prevent skin cancer, which was great because we have reduced those rates. Problem is, we've created a whole slew of other issues. And so, catch-22. So now you have the dermatologist and everybody else fighting because what should we do about vitamin D? Well, we should just replace it. We should give you a supplement for vitamin D, and we're starting to put it in our food supply. We're starting to put vitamin D in orange juice, in breads. I saw bread the other day that said now added vitamin D. We're starting to put it in our food supply because this is a big, big issue. You can safely take up to 4,000 units of vitamin D without being checked. But after that, you'll see patients that will come in because it's trendy right now, taking 10,000 units of vitamin D a day because Costco sells a 10,000 unit pill, which might be okay. The prescription dose is a 50,000 IU weekly dose. That's the prescription dose. So if they're taking 10,000 a day, now they're taking 70,000. And some of them have been doing that for years. And I'll check them and they're fine. They needed a lot of D. They don't go outside, they don't do anything, so they need it. Other people get high or are elevated vitamin D levels on 2,000 units. So if you're taking more than about 4,000, you should be being checked by some type of, a healthcare provider to make sure you're not toxic on D. What does toxic look like? We don't actually really know because it's not a huge problem. And the levels of what we think toxic is keep migrating up. Sunlight is the primary source, but this is not a license to sunbathe, and I tell patients that all the time because I don't even know that you can absorb it. Their industrialized countries have a huge problem with deabsorption versus unindustrialized countries, and we used to think that was all our sunblock and all of that, but apparently when you control for all those factors, we still absorb less D, so now they've decided, it's a theory, that maybe it's all the bathing that we do. Industrialized countries bathe more frequently, and so the cells that absorb D and are responsible for that process are the epidermal layer of the skin. And so if we bathe frequently, we're exfoliating frequently. And so if we get rid of all those cells, now all of a sudden we can't absorb D very well. Foods, there are not very many foods. Your fresh mushrooms absorb D, fresh fatty fishes from the ocean, egg yolks from a cage-free chicken, one that actually got some sun. Vitamin D2 and vitamin D3 are the two types of vitamin D that you will see in the pharmacy. And there are groups that believe that one is better than the other, and they strongly believe this. The reality is studies are pretty inconclusive where that is concerned. The prescription dose, interestingly, is vitamin D2. Most of what you'll see over the counter is vitamin D3. Most patients will respond to either one of them. So there isn't right now a huge push to do one or the other, and like I said, studies are very inconclusive. There is also a new trend to add K to vitamin D to somehow make it better absorbed, or I'm not even sure, it's a trendy thing. Zero evidence, zero actual evidence to suggest that actually helps anything. Calcium, not everybody needs calcium. When you're young, yes, it's important to build bone. When you're young, you do need calcium. You need to make sure you have a calcium-rich diet. However, as adults, taking extra calcium is not going to fix your bone. It is going to increase your risk of cardiovascular disease, kidney stones, chronic kidney disease. It's going to harden things you don't want to harden. And so we don't want to throw a whole bunch of calcium at your bone and think it's going to fix anything. We don't ever want to get more than 1,200 milligrams a day. And you notice I said get more than 1,200. I didn't say take more than 1,200. Because if you say take more than 1,200, what patients will do is take 1,200 milligrams of calcium, chase it with a half a gallon of milk, some yogurt, and some cheese. And now all of a sudden they're at 5,000 milligrams for the day. And so we have to be very careful with any vitamin recommendations, especially dietary vitamin recommendations, because what they get in their diet counts. And so it's a quick and easy, use a calcium calculator in your head. It's milk, a little glass of milk, 300 milligrams. Yogurt, 300 milligrams. A bite of cheese for me, which is a cubic inch, is 200 milligrams. It doesn't take much dairy to get where you're going. If they're a dairy eater at all, I promise they're getting a ton of calcium. Also, green leafy vegetables. Anything dark and green has a ton of calcium in it. One leaf of spinach has 10 to 15 milligrams of calcium. Anything darker than iceberg lettuce has a ton of calcium, so romaine and darker. Kale has a ton, Brussels sprouts, asparagus, dark and green, you're in business. So we also put calcium in a lot of foods, which is part of the reason we have a too much calcium problem in the United States now. In the 80s, we started putting calcium into foods because it was used as a preservative. Back in the 80s, all the parents in the 80s wanted to be preservative-free. Now all the parents want to be organic. But back then they wanted to be preservative-free. And so we started taking out man-made preservatives and putting in calcium, which acts as a preservative. So you'll see it in a lot of breads and in a lot of crackers and cereals, anything out of a box, very, very often has quite a bit of calcium in it, or at least some calcium, and it's not necessarily a naturally occurring calcium. It was put in there to act as a preservative. So we have to, we get a lot of calcium, especially in the Midwest. We're great dairy eaters here. And keeping in mind your soy milk, your almond milk, all the trendy milks, they also are fortified with calcium. So very often they have as much calcium in them or more than cow's milk does. You guys want a break? It's 10:02, I'm supposed to give you a break. We take 5 minutes.